Hello, and thank you for joining me again. I am Bree Pappen from the Special Collections and Museum Services Department here at the Pueblo City County Library District. I come to you from Rawlings Branch today, and I'm excited to present part 2 in our Roaring Twenties architectural series with architectural historian Wade Broadhead. In conjunction with the exhibit, Pueblo in the Roaring Twenties, A Decade of Boom to Bust, and in the 100th anniversary of the Great Pueblo Flood. We are going to talk today in part 2 about the post-flood era of Pueblo history, architectural history. Wade Broadhead is a city planner and staff of the Historic Preservation Committee in Pueblo. He has a degree from Western State College in Gunnison, Colorado, and he's a national preservation trainer for the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions and conducts trainings for cities across the United States in architectural preservation and historic preservation. So I invite you to enjoy Wade's part 2 talk of Pueblo architecture in the Roaring Twenties after the flood. Thank you.
Hello again. My name is Wade Broadhead. I'm a city planner with the City of Pueblo, an architectural historian, and we're here downtown today for part 2 of the architectural history series about Pueblo. We're going to talk about the 1920s this time. We're going to talk about the architecture and development of Pueblo after the Great Flood. Last session, we went right up to 1919, 1920, and 1921 when the flood happened. And luckily, the flood is kind of a nice bookend on an earlier era of development and architecture. And the 1920s began right about 1921 with a new style of architectural development and city development in cities across the United States. And so we are here at 4th Street and Main Street in front of the Colorado building. We are kind of right at the receding waters of the flood. We're a couple streets away from where the flood would have ended. And the pattern of development was already starting to kind of move northward. People were smart enough to know that they were out of the flood thing back in the 1920s. And so the Roaring Twenties is the term we normally think about with the 1920s. But if you would have told that to somebody in downtown Pueblo in 1921 after the flood, or even 1922, they would have laughed at you. And so things were a little rough. We started off that decade in a much rougher situation that we ended, and especially in Pueblo after the flood. But even in America, there was a lot of difficult things I talked about in section 1. They were just kind of wrapping up. And what really sets the 1920s aside is the very beginning of kind of modern living. The way you think of it as a modern city and modern living started in the 1920s. So there was definitely pieces of that in the teens, but the mass consumerism that we experience today really didn't exist until the 1920s. The mass production of consumer goods across all sectors, from the automobile to all sorts of goods in the house, really didn't proliferate into the 1920s. And so the middle class expanded during that period. And so we had this expanding middle class, and we had all these new people and these new consumers who could now buy into architecture that we'll see later in the series. But what that meant for downtown was that we had the streetcar suburb. We didn't have automobile suburbs just yet. They would happen at the end of the 20s and the 30s, but we had streetcar suburbs. We still had very compact development. We had some of the best urban development that I think city planners think about. We have a lot of the styles of the 1920s and compact development, along with great architecture and a very walkable, mass transit-oriented system. This would kind of hit its height and zenith in the 1920s, and the automobile would come back after World War II, and we kind of lose it forever. And so what we see here is the Colorado building. This would have been kind of like an early mall. It was, if you look at the directory, it was not mixed use like people think about. It was basically a huge kind of homage to capitalism. So you had any type of service that you could possibly think of inside there. You had architects, you had bankers, you had all sorts of different offices that were all stacked up in there. So this is, again, before the Pueblo Mall. This is, this you would have come to shop in Main Street in Pueblo. So you would have access to all the services you could possibly think of. Also, you have the 1920s began the new style kind of architecture. Reinforced concrete is now kind of uniformed, and you're able to build as high as you want. So you could have massive buildings, but I think they kind of stacked it based on the size of Pueblo. So you got buildings that were like 3 to 4 to 6 stories, and you had very simple forms with kind of very simple decoration. You said the beginning of modernism started to come in, and even though you have like little Art Deco embellishments, you would just see kind of very simple detailing. And you move away kind of the Victorian era and the progressive kind of mass. You move away from the progressive era art Beaux-Art movement of like heavy embellishing on buildings. And so really the building's all about commerce, and everything is about commerce in this period and consumerism. You see that reflected in the building. The architecture gets muted, and it really becomes about what that building is doing. All right, we're here in Mesa Junction to talk a little bit more about the 1920s and the architectural development of Pueblo. Behind us, we have that Broadway Arcade, which is one of the main buildings in Mesa Junction, and it would have been one of the most prominent buildings in the 1920s. The Broadway Arcade was built in 1924, and it represents the development pattern of the 1920s in Mesa Junction really well. Again, the whole south side of town was sort of an aspirational side of town. There was a lot of development in Bessemer, a lot of it on the north side and downtown, and lots of land was platted in the south side of town, but there weren't a lot of people in the Mesa Junction neighborhood really until the 1920s. There was some development, but advances in technology and the automobile made it much easier to start extending infrastructure into all those streets and grids that have been platted. And then Broadway became one of the main streets. It was actually originally Union Avenue that came up the hill and went into the neighborhood, but it was changed in the mid-century era because of association with Union Avenue, which was now seen as more of a red light district. But the Broadway Arcade building behind me is the site of the old Mesa Hotel, and in 18, which was now seen as more of a red light district. But the Broadway Arcade building behind me is the site of the old Mesa Hotel, and in 1893, there was a 5-story hotel here that actually burnt down. It would have been one of the most key buildings in Pueblo and really in southern Colorado when it burnt down. But you see the arched windows on the second story. That is not a common feature. That's a Romanesque feature that you see on Victorian buildings. And so it's kind of odd when you see that in a 1920s building, but it actually kept the second story of the Mesa Hotel. They probably and as kind of an homage to the existing Mesa Hotel. And so you had concrete construction come in. You had a modern building that kind of looks like the Colorado building. Again, very austere fronts with just a little bit of embellishments and keystones over the windows and some colored tiles and kind of very small deco elements. And like the Colorado building, there was a mixture of this idea of there's a mixture of this idea of entertainment and commerce together. Because you think about it, we're still pre-TV, really just talking about the radio, and they're talking about kind of the roaring 20s, kind of high era of theater. And so the Colorado building was built with a theater attached, and this building was built with a theater attached. Both of those theaters are no longer open. The owners are kind of looking at developing them maybe in the future, but these kind of really neat city blocks that came with commerce as well as entertainment. This building would have been significant of just general commerce. So there was nonprofits in there. There was army recruiting things in World War II. There was all different types of commerce. And so they had these kind of just open spaces that would kind of just shift as the market shifted. But again, like a lot of this neighborhood that was platted early, it didn't really get its bearings and really build out to the 1950s and 60s. This building was built in 1924. There was a bunch of issues. Some things didn't open until 1926. And then the theater closed in the late 20s and then was reopened in 1931. And so South Pueblo was still kind of getting its bearings of what it could really support in the neighborhood. And I think it really wasn't until World War II and then after World War II where they had the critical mass in the neighborhood that really could support the commerce. Okay, luckily, Pueblo is a nice compact town, so we can talk about the high style architecture of the 1920s as well as a whole new building type. And so before the 1920s, you didn't really have automobile oriented development or buildings of any type. And so we have one of the best examples of the new type of architecture, which is service stations. And so you wouldn't have seen these before the 1920s, and we don't really think about that. But you start to get a whole new building type, and now you get this kind of second or third wave of buildings that we think of historic would have been absolutely modern. And so a lot of the buildings in the east side, the north side, the south side of Pueblo, the corner lots would have been mansions built by some of the earliest settlers. Those mansions, a lot of places on the east side as well as south side, would have been bulldozed and turned into service stations because they made sense. And so, back in the 1920s when cars first started, people figured out you want to be on the corner of a busy street, and that persisted on into modern era. And so we have this beautiful service station. There's not many of these left in this style. There's one in Canyon City, and it's been multiple uses. I think it was a key store for a long time, but luckily the new owner, it's back to an automobile use, fixing cars, and luckily they haven't messed with a lot of the architecture, and you can still kind of see this high style Mediterranean revival. And Mediterranean revival and classical revival, and then English revival were very intentional. There was a very kind of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant development pattern, and so this is the time when the clan is sort of at its height in Colorado, and the architecture that you don't think about actually was very intentional. And so the styles are revival from Spain, Spanish, England revival, and they're particularly very not the styles. They didn't evoke a lot of the Southwestern American styles that tie to Mexico and kind of indigenous styles until the 1940s and 50s. All right, so behind us we have an English cottage style house. And so the English style architecture was incredibly popular. A lot of times it's called kind of stockbroker row. And so a lot of people were making money now in the stock market. A lot of kind of the middle class and the office class was kind of taking hold, and they wanted to have this kind of signaling that they were a little wealthier than other people around them. And so you had in the farther reaches of Mesa Junction, the south side, east side, especially the north side, you had a lot of these 1920s brick cottages, usually 1 story, 1.5 story. They were almost always brick. A lot of them would have the cat slide roof. They would have decorative brickwork that was on there that kind of showed there was a little bit extra of an embellishment. Some would have Art Deco elements, but a lot of them would have English elements. And so behind us, you see the half timbering, which is kind of taken from like a 1500s context in England. But it was kind of a mishmash of styles that we think of as historic, but at that time would have been kind of signaling that you're associated with England, with making money over there, and kind of the renewed economic activity that was going on in America. Another thing that we're going to see here in a second is new building types for houses. You start to see garages. We think of kind of as just a no-brainer, but you didn't have garages come in. You had some livery stables, and you would have stables on some of the larger houses, but most of the cottages in the turn of the century before the 1920s would have had no planning for any type of garages. And so it's now that you start to see houses come with garages built either attached to them or in the back, and then some houses in Pueblo even kind of came with porte cocheres, and so kind of an opening area where you could kind of drive your automobile in. And so this is the very early period where architects and homeowners trying to figure out how are we going to kind of deal with vehicles. And now they're one of the largest considerations, I think, when people are looking at houses. And this is kind of the very early era of like, how do we plan for a garage? Do we put it on the side, put it in the back? Are we going to have one car? At this time, there's just one car. So people don't even think of 2-car garages. You don't think of a large garage because you're only going to be able to afford one car for most of the middle class. So you see these either kind of open carports, porte cocheres, or you see a very small little brick architecturally compatible garage in the 1920s. And that starts to change after World War II. All right, no survey of 1920s architecture would be complete without a stop in the neighborhood in front of a bunch of Sears Craftsman arts and crafts houses. These are what most people think about when they think of 1920 architecture, because they were just such solid houses that people still love. And the reason I think a lot of people love these houses is they're the very first example of kind of like modern living. If you go into a floor plan of a 1920s house like this, it's a little bit more open. It feels like what would come in the 1950s, and really what kind of open floor plans that we really crave now with our modern housing. So even though we think of these as historic, they're really kind of the very first flourishing of modern housing for a huge middle class. And so we're in Mesa Junction, our last stop, on a street that has a whole row of probably Sears Roebuck ordered from the catalog houses, or they might have been builders, but this is a whole row that all would have gone in fairly close together. And so before this, you'd have builders build a couple houses here and there, maybe a couple of years, but mass production facilities and the way that we built houses changed drastically. They moved to Western framing from balloon framing. And so you could order a house, it would show up, and you and your friends could go build it, or a builder would order it and build it. All right, there's lots of different ways you could build a house in the 1920s. You could order it from a catalog, or you could have a builder build your house. And so the middle class needed housing, and they wanted more middle class housing. They didn't want to be blocks of apartments downtown. And so the Sears Roebuck catalog, which had always been around, really kind of proliferated, and the cost of housing went down, and so it got made much cheaper for this emergent middle class to be able to buy housing everywhere. And these houses are so great. Some of them were brick, some of them were stone, some of them were brick, some of them were wood, but they all kind of came in kits for the most part. And so you see, they had very kind of arts and crafts elements to them that are very diagnostic, as historians like to say. They have exposed rafter tails is generally a huge one, and a lot of them would have on the front and the side. They'd exposed beams. Those aren't really that functional. They're really just kind of display the style. There was divided lights over the windows, which is generally another way you can tell you're looking at a 1920s house. And for whatever reason, that kind of went out of fashion after World War II. So it's another good way to tell that you're looking at a 1920s house. They also were very big into porches. It was kind of the indoor-outdoor living space, and kind of these like green suburbs, people moving out of the very busy downtown. If you think about downtown Pueblo in the 1920s, we had tons of rail coming in, which was great for kind of mobility and walkability, but it would have been just covered in soot and very loud. And so way out here in the edge of Mesa Junction, you had a much kind of idyllic, quiet setting that this middle class wanted to be living in. All right, another key aspect of these 1920s houses that we don't think about every day is that they would have been the first modern houses in terms of plumbing, electricity, all that stuff would have been part and parcel of a new house back then. A lot of the other ones were kind of coming in the teens, and newer houses might have had them, but they would have kind of retroactive. You would have had outhouses and houses from 1902, 1904. And so these houses would have been the first modern houses. You would have had indoor plumbing, you would have had electricity, you would have had a lot of the things you think about in a modern house nowadays. And both houses on the corner here, one of the reasons we stopped is that these would have been the first houses with built-in garages. And this one's got a 2-car garage, and it's 2-story. So this would have probably been a little bit more affluent person. This would have been a little bit more expensive of a house. These houses when I'm in these houses are generally a lot larger than they look on the street. And so this would have been kind of maybe an executive or kind of an upper middle class person who was able to buy a little bit bigger unit. And they had a 2-car garage. So they would have had 2 cars, which would have been a big deal, because up until the 1920s, most people would have only been able to